Right. Welcome, everyone, to Crisis Triaging 102. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to start promptly right on time, even though I know a lot of people are going to be joining. As you join, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. We love it if you would state your name, your organization, your role, what you do, and one concern that you've been hearing or you've been experiencing in this current climate. And we're gonna, without further ado, we're gonna get rolling. So Erin, if you can move us to the next slide. And let's meet the conversation starters for today. You're going to help us to engage in this wonderful conversation. So first and foremost, Miss Malaika Serrano, thank you for joining us today. You guys can read a little bit about their bios across the bottom. So I'm not, and on LinkedIn. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on professional accolades. Instead, I want to share a personal insight that I've gleaned from conversing with and talking to each one of these positively infectious human beings. So with Malaika, one of the things that I really recognized early on was just what an advocate she is for the student population, obviously for diversity and inclusion, but how powerful she is at affecting real change, real positive change, and empowering the voices of those that she works with, and also how dedicated she is to making sure that we all have really the right skills that we need to affect that positive change. So Malaika, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Also on the call is Dr. Terrell Strayhorn. Dr. Terrell is an incredible thought leader around community and creating a safe space and creating a community of belonging, particularly amongst student populations. One of the things that really struck me is he is a natural born storyteller, and he really uses stories effectively to help other people learn and find a path forward for themselves and to build a better future for themselves. So thank you, Dr. Strayhorn. And finally, Miss Brittany Cole. Brittany Cole is the founder of Career Thrivers, and Brittany was kind enough to have me participate in a panel recently around the topic of allyship. And as we think about the student population and effectively moving that student population into the workforce, Brittany's going to bring some really powerful insights to the table today. So thank you, Miss Brittany. And Erin, if we can move forward, please. Thank you. So I'm sure that you all have seen these recent headlines. And so we want to set the tone for today's conversation and acknowledge, what is happening now and in the moment. And I mean, goodness gracious, it just feels like it's something new every day, some new challenge for us to work together to overcome. But the issues that we're facing are obviously very real, and people are also taking very quick actions. I love this second headline surrounding Harvard and MIT. Had the opportunity to listen to a little bit of NPR yesterday with the Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts, and the impact that this is having on so many different levels, economically, obviously, but what this is, the further pain that this is creating for our student population, particularly for our international students as well. But we're gonna be talking a lot as we move to this next slide, Erin. We're gonna be talking a lot about the topics that we have originally presented as well, around things like inter and intercultural dialogues, fostering belonging and development, what's happening, student voices and agency, and those practical interventions and frontline training. We could see that based on our registrants, these are all pretty equally, relatively equal, of relatively equal interest. So let's go ahead and dive into topic one. And this is around student voices and students as agents of change. And so in exploring topics that have been raised by students, there's a lot that we've got to cover. And I want to go ahead and take a moment to now defer to our panelists. And let's go ahead and kick off with a question for the panel. So from COVID to financial downturn to border restriction to outcries for racial equality and justice, there is no doubt about it that our students find themselves learning and transitioning in one of the greatest times of upheaval in our generation. So to our panel, what are you hearing and seeing on the front lines? What are the concerns of students at present, and what are they voicing as agents of change? And by the way, for all of our registrants, as students and educators or as student advocates, what concerns do you have or are you hearing voiced? And please feel free to share that dialogue and that conversation in the chat box as the panelists begin to share their knowledge. So Malika, let's start with you.
Great, fantastic. So thank you so much, Tracy, for that great introduction. And hello, panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments. So just, kind of one quick piece around the student voices and agency that I'm hearing a lot from our students. I've been talking with students who were studying abroad, but then suddenly were ripped away from whatever country they were studying in, coming back to the United States. And so that feeling, quote unquote, of feeling unfinished is something that has been sitting with them, as well as, trying to understand and unpack what is going on and make sense of things. And so what I hear from them is a lot of language around looking at mental health. And so not just concerns about and reflections on what's happening for them internally, but also paying attention to what's happening with their friends, their family, as well as other peers. And then now, as we're kind of segueing into this different season within the backdrop of COVID-19, with the racial equality and the protests, a lot of our students, they have a very strong sense for social justice and also an understanding of their platforms. And they're empowered and they are using that power, and it's beautiful. And I see Sister Brittany nodding her head, Dr. Strayhorn nodding his head. And that's just a really beautiful thing. So that's what I'm hearing immediately from my students. And so I'm going to step aside and I'd love to hear from my other colleagues.
Thank you. Dr. Strayhorn?
Go ahead.
No, Brittany, go ahead.
I was going to add to that, Malika. I was shaking my head because I think coming from the perspective of employers, so really looking at early career professionals and also students relative to interns that are a part of organizations, just this sense of being really aware of from a social justice perspective, and then having an expectation that employers and organizations are going to go beyond their corporate statements to actually have real action, I think is really something that we're hearing. So it's like, okay, there's an acknowledgement of it's great that we're speaking up and we're having conversations and we're sharing stories, but what else is going to take place? So I think that that's definitely something that's been raised that I'm definitely hearing.
Thank you.
So tag, I'm it. And I want to build upon what's been shared because, we've got a rhythm here, and it's right that, what we're hearing and seeing from students everywhere, but certainly, I'm in Virginia within the US. And so the students in just this month, I was also in Tennessee. So in my move from Tennessee to Virginia, touching and hearing from students across the country, they're telling us something that actually should not be a surprise to us.
Right.
Shouldn't be a surprise, partly because of social media and Twitter, right? So, I don't know, 5-7 years ago, you might remember conversations popped off where people were saying things like, oh my gosh, what is Twitter? Why do people tweet? I don't want to share every single, idea I have. But we really shouldn't have responded that way. We should have embraced it and sat with it and struggled and said, what does this say about where we're going? And we were going 5 to 7 years ago exactly where we are right now, where people will realize, much like Malika said and Brittany echoed, and I'm about to tag on the end and say that they have a voice. and they've got a platform, and they've got mechanisms, and they have energy, and they have power, and they will not be hesitant, and not all the time, um, careful even about how they will raise it. So I'm blessed because I was born to my parents, and my grandmother helped raise me, and I know how they taught me about airing my perspectives, and they believed and they lived a very gradual progressivism where you can speak when called upon, you should be grateful for what you have, you should, when you have difficulty, you find a way of doing it amicably, and that worked for a season. But today's students are helping us understand that what they want is not equality, it is equity. That we're going to have to fill those gaps, and we're going to have to make up for some disparities and major disproportionate impacts, especially across communities of color. They're going to hold us accountable to it. And they also want, I mean, it would be no surprise that I would say belonging. They want to know, hello, I matter. You see me. Say my name. I want to hear it. I want to know that my life matters. I want to see it on a sign. I want to see it in a protest. I want to wear the t-shirt. I want you to wear it. I want you to affirm for me that, my life matters just as much as yours does. And so I'll stop because I, can get excited about these things. But ultimately, it's like Aretha Franklin met 2020, RESPECT. That's what they want. And that's what students are asking for.
Yeah. Mic drop in minute 12. All right. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I would like, before we move on to the next topic, open-ended question in the chat. Let's have a dialogue. As a student educator or student advocate, what concerns do you have? What are you hearing voiced that maybe hasn't been expressed from the panelists so far? 1, 2, 3, go in the chat. But also, do we have any students on, any students or teacher assistants or, on this call today? Please raise your hand. And in fact, Aaron, I don't know if we can unmute, but if we could just get a hello or a hi from, let's hear the voice. We're talking about student voices. So raise your voice if you are one and you're on this webinar today. All right, I guess we got a whole lot of educators. So guys, the onus is on us to take this back to the streets, what we learned today, and create these communities of belonging and these safe spaces. Moving on now to topic number 2. Okay, so we've got a big picture frame of reference around, the topics that are happening. Clearly, what are the hot topics? And a big piece of being able to affect change. And I'm a huge proponent for this. You guys have heard me. We always talk about Speak Human, and we talk about finding awareness and compassion for self to be able to also find the compassion and the curiosity to seek to understand others first and foremost before we seek to be understood. But that requires unpacking our identities. And it is, Dr. Strayhorn, you had talked about kind of the false dichotomy between, a national identity and an international identity. And really, we now live in a post-internet world where we don't really have that luxury anymore. That's not really relevant. So in moving on to topic 2, let's actually start with Dr. Strayhorn. We broached that subject of that false dichotomy that exists between being a good domestic citizen versus being a global citizen. And obviously, we are all fans of internationalizing education and producing good global citizens. But one of the questions you asked is, are we ready for home first? Are we ready to be a human first? So let's talk about the social identities of learners and advisors and how they present depending on context. And Malika, we're definitely going to come back to you on this topic as well.
Okay, so I'll tee it up, and then Malika, you just take it on home and drop the mic. Okay. So, I appreciate that segue into this particular topic, Tracy, because so as a college professor, and I started my career at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, great school, great place, the right place for me to be at the beginning of my career. Met lots of wonderful faculty, staff, students who join us today. But I remember, so this was circa 2005 to 2010, around that time period. And we had an effort coming out of the Office of the Provost called Ready for the World. And so, it was great. It had all the right messaging, the brilliant orange that, is characteristic of UT Knoxville. And then this whole curriculum that was about getting our students ready to be global citizens. Mm-hmm. Remember what I said, 2005 to 2010. Something happened domestically in 2008. It changed my life forever. And lots of people who look like me. Let me tell you, my grandmother who's deceased, it changed her life. And it is the election of President Barack Obama. It was one of the last moments I got to cherish with my grandmother as she cried and talked about, honey, I knew it was going to happen, but I didn't think I'd live to see it. And so here I am with tears in my eyes because I'm like, I just couldn't believe that the country would actually do it with me. Like we would elect our first Black president. And then the very next day, I was called to campus early for a meeting that I won't go into details. It's not necessarily for the story, but ultimately it was because the campus had been defaced. Because people who were upset about that decision, who were implied members of our campus community, acted out their rage and hate on relics and traditions on our campus, right? So in the middle of this effort, very significant investment to get students ready for the world, I realized our students really aren't even ready to live with each other. Mm. So how do we strike a balance between our focus on internationalization and our focus on civic community and democracy and civility and respect and diversity, even within our boundaries? And the second part, or the final part of that is, I think sometimes we're so, as you just said, Tracy, I mean, we live in a global society now, right? So I grew up fantasizing about other countries because people told me race doesn't matter over there. And then as life would have it, I would fall into this blessed opportunity, like all of us, to have education. I'll come back to that in a later question, that got me moved into the world. And I would go to other countries, and before you know it, I'm standing in, so if you're on this call, I love your country, but I'm just gonna call us all out, because we need to be called out so that we can get to where we're trying to get as a whole global society, right? So I would go to Rome, and all of a sudden, while I'm standing in front of the Colosseum, I'm being called out as a Black guy. So race matters in Rome. Then I go to Ireland, and it matters there. And I won't go through every single place, but at some point I picked up that Cornel West had it right. Race matters. It's not a U.S. topic. It's a global topic. And as educators, we must strive to prepare our students to be both live in their local space and live globally. Tag your it, Malika.
Great.
Oh yeah, my goodness.
Yeah, please, Malika.
No, I was saying beautiful. That was beautiful. And Dr. Strayhorn, I just have one memory before I kind of segue into just a few thoughts that I wanted to share around this topic, and that is when you mentioned the election of Barack Obama. I had just come home from the hospital with my newborn son. And yes, he was born 2 days before Obama's election. And I remember sitting on the couch with my mother, who grew up in the segregated South, myself, and then my baby boy. And it was just this beautiful memory that I will cherish forever. And so when you lifted this up, it really spoke to me. So thank you for that. Absolutely. I really appreciate that. Yeah. I think, Dr. Strayhorn, thank you so much again for your, really, really strong remarks. The word that comes to me, or the frame that comes to me, kind of looking at perhaps how we can kind of marry these, would be looking at inclusive pedagogy. Because, inclusive pedagogy really is looking at the social identities of both the learner or the student, as well as the educator or the advisor. And that we all have a shared responsibility of understanding and unpacking our own identities, because they do have a profound impact on the experiences of our students. And when Tracy and I were talking before, yeah, sorry, hi, Della. I just saw in the chat. When Tracy and I were talking about this before, we were looking at how our identities present in a variety of different contexts, and to what extent, you know, that has implications for our students, particularly our international students. And so one of the things that we lifted up, you know, is the fact that some of our students, when they're coming from abroad, yes, race matters. I agree with you, absolutely, Dr. Strayhorn, and how race is presented or how it's defined changes depending on one's context. So take Malika Serrano, for example. When I'm in South Africa, I suddenly magically get whisked away into a different racial category, which is called colored, with a U. However, in the United States, you know, the vestiges of slavery run deep, right? That one drop rule. You know, one drop, you are African American. My great-great-grandfather, who was a slave, had blonde hair and blue eyes. But guess what, y'all? He was a slave. He was a slave. And so how race is constructed here matters, as well as how it's constructed and other identities that we carry in various contexts. And so it's mission critical, in my view, that we start having these conversations with our students, our domestic, or the US students before they go abroad, but also too, engaging these conversations with international students before they come here. Because, you know, their safety and their welfare depend on it. So I'm gonna pause for a moment and see if our colleague Brittany wants to say something.
I think you two covered it beautifully. Yeah, so nothing to add on this one.
I'll add, even though I'm the moderator. This is something I feel really passionate about, and I think that just the general awareness, something you said, Malika, about teachers and learners. You know, we're thinking about that today on this call in the context of higher education or institutions of learning or cross-cultural exchange, but that's humanity. You know, at any moment in time, during this conversation, we're just switching seamlessly back and forth from teacher, learner. And, you know, in our last webinar, we talked a lot about the internationalization of education and how important it is for all of our frontline staff to have this recognition. Can you imagine what it's like to be, you know, that there's going to be a big difference between being that Black Brazilian student who is coming into, you know, a United States context versus that white, and where are they ending up? Are they at an HBCU, or, you know, are they at a predominantly white university, you know, an Ivy League? And how they perceive themselves is very different from how they are going to be perceived once they get here. And that, you know, what can we do? And maybe this will be kind of the final question, but what can we do as educators to remain both learners and educators in this context? And what are some ways in which you think that we can prepare both the international and the domestic students for this understanding that just that aha moment that says, oh yeah, that might feel really different for that person, and I didn't even think about that. Thoughts? I know this is a non-prompted question, you know.
I mean, one part of this that comes to my mind is about empathy, right? So that's a really, we have a literature base on how do you teach empathy, and we have a science base that says it's what we once called a soft skill, but if you've ever tried to practice empathy, it's not soft at all. And we can look at many countless examples in society that demonstrate it's pretty hard to cultivate and you know, manufacture across individuals. So educators, I think, when we teach in ways, and maybe it's through the frame that Malika talked about, through inclusive pedagogy, we help cultivate students' empathy skills. You know, what does it mean to stop talking and listen? What does it mean to not rush to judgment and to struggle with dissonance? You know, I used to teach a diversity class, not that I have the answer either, but one of the assignments in the class that students always got frustrated with because it was so experiential was, it was called the other side project. So for example, if Brittany was my partner in that class, I would have to expose Brittany to a part of my world that she's never experienced. And so for instance, you know, I am, maybe I'd take her to my family reunion because we do a lot of stuff. I mean, singing, dancing, got a whole church service, all that stuff going on. It's very organized, got t-shirts, you know, bumper stickers. So I'd bring her to this production and have her experience that. And then in exchange, Brittany would expose me to a part of her world that I've never experienced. And the only part of the assignment you had to do was come to the class and talk about it. What was it like? What did you experience? What were your hesitations and worries? What did you learn? What changed you? You know, how did Brittany get me prepared to enter into her world, and reciprocally? Every single educator joining us today can take that framework and modify it for their own discipline or subject. So if we can teach students how to step into someone else's shoes and experience it, not judge it, just experience it, talk about it, that starts to cultivate those skills.
Dr. Strayhorn, I feel like you're a walking advertisement for using the Apto platform. Thank you. That was unintended.
Absolutely.
That was unintended, but I appreciate it. I'll take it. All right, moving into our poll question. This is going to be an anonymous one, guys, so be honest. How aware do you think your organization is about the identity crisis which faces our students and the need for inter and intercultural understanding in order to be not just good global citizens, but as Dr. Strayhorn said, empathetic human beings? How aware? Keep going, guys. 61% completed. Got a few more seconds. All right, let's move on. Thank you all very, very much. And we want to share those poll results. All right, so the winner is somewhat aware. Somewhat aware. So I think that that's a pretty overwhelming majority, over 53%. So what that says to me is we've got some work to do in awareness. So thank you all very much for sharing that. All right, Erin, if we can move to the next topic, which is topic 3, around the lines of now fostering that belonging and that development. So once we've helped our students to unpack that, now we've got to actually begin to build that community and that allyship. So Dr. Strayhorn, back to you. Your authentic story to me, as I mentioned in the introduction, is so powerful because it really is one of true human reciprocity. You shared a story about being empowered by someone in higher education, and that enabled you to empower others. So can you please share that story briefly, how you found that sense of community and that pathway to success through education, and what that's taught you about how we can foster better communities of belonging now?
Sure, I will begin that story. So I'm reminded somewhere in 3rd or 4th grade, we watched a movie about Miss Jane Pittman, and there's a point in the film, she's telling the story as a slave about like how far back you want to go. So that's my question to you, Tracy, like how far back do you want to go? Because I mean, I can go all the way back, you know, but what the story that Tracy's alluding to is a conglomeration of a lot of different moments. So, you know, I'm an educator. It's an important part of my identity. So too is my race. So too is my religion. but I pride myself on being with all of us in this great profession and experiment called education in a democratic society, because I came from a line of educators, and as has been mentioned, I've benefited from educators who understood community and allyship and what it meant to create high touch environments, even regardless of the space of the institution. So to highlight a couple of these that come to mind, I shared the story, my first child was born to me as an undergrad. I was an undergrad at the University of Virginia. I was a freshman about to become a sophomore. Long story, different debate for a different day, how it happened and all this. But I'm here, like I'm a young guy and I've got a kid coming, and and I haven't told my parents, and I'm also an RA, and I'm trying to figure out, how do I do this? And long story short, there emerged out of that chaos a person by the name of Dean Angela Davis, who happened to be the Dean of Residence Life at UVA at the time, who heard about me, heard about the young man who's losing his mind because he's a good student, but he's got himself in this situation and he needs some help. And she brings me into her office. This is a large, public, highly regarded, institution. But this dean of students, an educator, brings me into her office, talks to me. She asked me a question that broke me down into tears. She said, "How are you today?" No one had asked me that throughout that whole episode. I started talking to her and telling her, like, here's the situation. She asked me questions like, how am I going to take care of my kid? I didn't know. I was an undergrad. What will I do? Long story shorter, before you know it, she used her seat and her power to, the rules at that time would have meant that I would have to stop being an RA because I now had a dependent. But she also knew my story because I told it to her. At least I stumbled through it. And that is, if I was no longer an RA, that meant that the cost of housing would be added to my bill, which meant my parents could not afford for me to go to UVA, which meant I am no longer college enrolled. And this dean, who had the power and the empathy, changed the rules. Got her committee together and said, well, we're gonna make an exception in this situation. Now I had to move out of the residence hall I was living in and go live with student parents, but it was fine. Like, it all worked out. So that was one of those moments where to this day, I don't know how, well, I know how, it's 23 years ago almost now. And I now know that I'm here today talking to you all with my good friends because Angela Davis made room for me. Later, I go into my doctoral program. I have a doctoral advisor who does not look like me. So for everyone on the call who's thinking that you have to look a certain way or be a certain height, let's get that out of the way. It's not true. My doctoral advisor at the time was a 70-plus-year-old white male Texan with blonde hair. He looked like Hulk Hogan to me all the time, but like the wrinkled version, whatever. And love him to pieces. But he cared about me. This guy had high expectations of me. Every time I was in his presence, I felt like I could do it. In moments where I felt like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I've gotten myself in too deep, he would affirm, you, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And the story that I mentioned to Tracy when we were talking that I can't always get through because it's such one of those stories about what mentors do. My doctoral advisor told me I should be a professor. And 15 years ago, when I finished my doctoral degree, I didn't know what a professor did. I said, what does that mean? What would that look like? He showed me his phone and walked me through 2 weeks of his life. So anybody who knows what I do sometimes, he pointed to a keynote and I was like, a keynote? What is a keynote? And that's crazy to me that 15 years ago, I didn't know what a keynote was. And if I know anything nowadays, I know what a keynote is, and I hope I know how to give one because education and people like Angela Davis and Don got me there. Don told me I would need certain skills in order to be successful in my role. I told him, okay, fine. He said, you need to go to this training. That training was like $1,700. What Don didn't know was I had borrowed money from everybody in my family line to get through my doctoral program. My mama didn't have it. My daddy didn't have it. My grandma didn't have it. I owed everybody by the time I finished. And I was not gonna go back to my village and ask them for more money. And so I was vulnerable. I told Don, I said, Don, I'd love to do that, but I don't have the money. He said, well, young fella, you don't have to have the money because guess what? I've got it. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's going to give me $1,700. And he didn't. What he did was he walked down the hall to his secretary and said, my advisor had retired with me. I was his last student. He goes to Vicki Meadows. I don't know why her name comes to me at this moment. And he says, Vicki, you know all that professional development money I got left saved up? She said, yeah. He said, give it all to Terrell. He needs it. I don't. And he gave me a gift. Why? Because he believed in me. He thought I could benefit from that. And all of us can do that as educators. That's how you invest in support and give. And I think that's, to me, I mean, I left feeling connected and cared about, like I matter. Dawn knew me, Angela Davis knew me, and that's what community and allyship is about.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Strayhorn. And, you know, and that for you, those were overcoming pre-COVID obstacles. Those are overcoming, you know, the national leadership. I know Miss Daisy Rodriguez Patel had put something in the chat surrounding the concerns that she and students and all of us have around current leadership and national leadership and the governance policies that have come out this week, and the impact of that on is so far reaching. And one of the things that I'd like to just pause on, and again, I'm going off script, sorry, but I'd like to pause here for a moment because I feel like this is on the hearts and minds of everyone on this call. How do we do this given mobility restrictions, the current mobility restrictions, this catch-22 situation that it feels like we are in? But I always tell my team this. I say, for every one problem, there are an infinite number of possible solutions. And I really, truly believe that. So I'd like to take a moment and just thoughtfully brainstorm, and perhaps maybe those of you who have registered and are attending can share in the chat box as well. What can we do right now in this present moment in time to help to remove some of that fear and to engender some of that sense of community and belonging, to particularly to the international students, number one, who are thinking, all my family put everything they had into sending me here, and now I may be sent back. Am I going to finish college? You know, this type of scenario, right? And to the domestic students who are, you know, living through this current outcry for social justice, and not just equality, but equity. Thank you, Dr. Strayhorn. What can we do now? What action can we take the minute we get off this call?
So I would add, Tracy, that I think, you know, Dr. Strayhorn laid out two really great examples of things that all of us can do. And I know from a corporate perspective, we call that sponsorship, right? So it's about how do you use your power and your privilege to say, hey, I'm being really intentional, not just about recognizing that there's difference, but I'm being intentional about including difference at every level of my organization. And I think when you take into account the perspective of leadership, I think oftentimes what happens is that we look at, you know, this idea or this research or even this practice of diversity, equity, inclusion as a subset of everything else that's already doing. Like, it kind of falls to the side. It's like you do the annual unconscious bias check the box training and you're done. When in actuality, inclusion and equity should be an integrated, embedded part of leadership development. It's how you are developing as a leader. And so I think with that then comes this responsibility as a leader to say, hey, how am I extending my privilege? How am I extending my power to make those inroads for people who have less? And I think we just heard two really great stories of what that can look like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love, thank you. I put a big preach in there because you're just like making my heart swell. But Rainer Lom also mentioned, you know, reaching out, like literally physically reaching out to the students, getting on the phone, getting on Slack, getting on text message, you know, getting on WhatsApp, whatever they use. Get there and just physically check in. How are you doing? What do you need? Are you okay? Make it about your sphere of influence, right? I mean, that feels like a very immediate thing, but yeah, going back to your comments, Brittany, and the same conversation came up about international education. Why are we putting these things in boxes when they really should be permeating, you know, the whole batch of bread, the whole batch of dough constantly, and getting that, you know, to become a day in and day out awareness check. So wonderful. Okay, let's move to the topic number 3 poll. What do we got? Poll number 2. And again, this is, oh wait, are we? Yes. Okay, how strongly do you believe your organization is invested in fostering communities of belonging? And again, these are anonymous, so feel free to be honest, not throwing anybody's organization under the bus. Few more seconds. All right, it looks like it's stalled out. So let's stop here and let's take a look at those results. So these numbers look a little more encouraging, somewhere between strongly and somewhat strongly. But I think one of the things that comes to mind with this is that, educators by nature, there is a lot of empathy there. There are a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning people. But this brings us to the conversation that we had yesterday about actual actions and practical interventions. And so, Miss Brittany, I want to tee you up because we had talked about the fact that many of the students that are going to be represented by APTO, and the stakeholders on this call are really going to naturally gravitate towards careers which place them in certainly intracultural context. So not just country to country, but also, all of the differences that make up the America that we live in here. And in other countries, it's the same, right? All of the different nationalities, all of the different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, gender diversity, orientation, all of the above. So when it comes to the workplace, what experiences and key learnings have you been gleaning through your work on allyship coaching at Career Thrivers that might help empower them as they prepare to transition from academic to work life?
Sure, Tracy. So, and I saw Vivian's comment there about awareness, and I definitely think that that's the place that really all of this work starts, with having a really strong sense of emotional intelligence, both self and social awareness. But when you mention career, I think one of the first things that comes to mind for students is this idea of PIE. So many may be familiar with that, but it's this idea of performance, image, and exposure. And when you are having conversations with hiring managers, with HR around career advancement and what really moves the needle, from thinking, early career, mid-career professionals, and even those that are on track for the C-suite, image and exposure become really important. So then you ask yourself, okay, well, if exposure is really important, then there's this idea of allyship then, where you have leaders, and oftentimes, as Dr. Strayhorn said, leaders that don't look like you, especially if you're diverse talent, that are kind of making those inroads. And so I think some practical things that we can think about in terms of allyship, we like to share kind of this acronym for allies. And so I'll go through it pretty quickly. Vivian hit on the first one. The A is about awareness. So really, what are you doing to increase your first self-awareness, being aware of your own mindset, being aware of, you have a thought about someone, and before you move further down the path, you ask yourself, why do I think that? What is really driving that insight about said person or group of people? I think that comes first. I think secondly, it's about learning. During this time, we hear a lot about listening, which is the second L. And I think listening is so important, hearing those stories, but I also think there's this intentional action of allies to be active in the process of learning, of doing the research, of tapping into the podcasts, the books, all of the great resources that are out there to really learn more and expand your cross-cultural competence. I think next, the I is about inclusion. So again, we talked about this. How are you being intentional around including difference at every level? And then the E, as Dr. Strayhorn shared, is about experiences. So what are you doing in your own personal life to be more intentional around just having different experiences of different cultures? Of course, the APTO platform is a great way to do that through story, but thinking about both professionally and personally, how are you improving your own experiences? And then last but not least, the S, and I could talk about this all day, is around sponsorship, because it's great to have mentors. It's great to have people that you glean from their experiences, what they've learned, as a way to filter your own decision-making process through. But then there's this kind of secondary relationship that's also really important, and that's having that in someone that has that positional power, that's in that seat of authority, to open up the door. So I like to think of the two for students, because I know sometimes those words are used interchangeably, and then you throw coaching in there, you're like, what is that? And so mentorship is really about sharing. People share what to do. So they share what to do based on their experiences. And then sponsorship on the other end is about creating those opportunities to have that, you know, advancement actually happen. And so I think those are some practical ways that really we can truly be allies, and really take on this, not this identity of this kind of savior complex that sometimes allyship can have, but rather being committed to this lifelong process of learning, unlearning. That's where the work happens. You know, it's not just in the consuming of content, but it's being challenged in thought and perspective around, what do I need to unlearn, and then relearning, and being committed to that as a lifelong process to help students.
Yeah. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you. Well, that's a perfect segue for us into topic 4, which is around the idea of practical interventions and frontline training. And I noticed Darla had posed a really great question to the entire group in the chat surrounding what are some key changes we'd like to see leaders make. I'm not sure if that's referencing just national leadership or if that's referencing leadership in higher education, but go ahead and put it all out there. Just maybe be specific about which one is which. But I really appreciate everyone participating in that. So please continue that conversation. But as we begin to wrap up today's panel, this is going to be directed to the entire panel. I quoted Dr. Strayhorn in some of the materials, I hope you don't mind, saying that our students' success depends on the level of our creativity. One of my favorite things about being alive and being a human being is the opportunity to be a creative problem solver. And again, I talked about infinite ways to, to solve a single problem. And sometimes the choices that we make about how to solve a problem speak volumes about who we are, what we value, what we believe in. So let's get practical. I'd like for us to all take some time to outline and provide practical, tangible interventions and solutions that have either proven successful, where have we seen proven success, or that are innovative and moving us into a new direction and a new future state. And remember that the goal of this webinar is to better engage, prepare, and empower our students for positive experience and success. So whoever feels led to begin, and I want to encourage the group to keep this conversation going in the chat and to add your thoughts in the chat as well.
So the Spirit's moving me.
All right.
And because I'm sitting with all of the wonderful goodness that Brittany and Dr. Strayhorn, have been sharing with us, and just sort of thinking about reflecting in my own kind of personal life, particularly around these last 6 weeks or so, what's been going on. And so kind of tying in, I think, these two pieces and then directly to this question would be something that's been happening. It's happening currently in my own work life. And that is everyone is hurting. Everyone is hurting. And as far as the DEI journey goes with respect to the organization as a whole, we're at the beginning steps of the process. And so the listening piece and the awareness piece is 100% where we are right now. And so what I did was a couple of weeks ago, I organized a series of listening circles. And if you're not familiar with a listening circle essentially is it's a space, it's an opportunity for people to come together. There are some ground rules, and there's the conversation is centered around a particular topic, and people are able to just sort of lift up what's on their hearts and their minds and in their spirit. And the majority of the people who are there in the space are there to listen. And so I led a series of listening circles within my organization, and it was very profound. I found that a lot of folk really just had not felt that psychological safety to be able to lift up how they were feeling, you know, how they were being affected. And when we show up at work, it's really important to be able to provide those spaces for people to be their true, full, authentic selves, the belonging, you know, Dr. Strayhorn is talking about, that Brittany is talking about. And so from that point, what we've now done is we've looked at really accelerating our development of employee resource groups, or ERGs, which Brittany, I'm sure, is very familiar with. And in the higher ed space, we tend to have these done on campus. But for some organizations, I think it's a little bit newer, particularly in the space of looking at international education. And so I'll just close by saying that I think one of the best ways we can support our students is by starting first and foremost at home, doing the work at home. And but if we don't do that, then we cannot be the strongest advocates, the supporters, the champions that our students need right now. So,
thank you, Malaika.
I would add to that, I think in addition to the listening, taking a look at who's at the table, both through the lens of diversity that you can see, but also diversity that you can't see. So, you know, do you have diversity of experience? Are there students at the table as you're thinking through decisions that are going to impact them? And I also wanted to share a recent case study. I think McDonald's, so it's a completely different industry, but I think it brings home this point of sometimes what sponsorship looks like, and how sponsorship really is one of the most selfless acts of leadership. Has nothing to do with the person that's extending their power. So Black Entertainment Television recently did their award shows, and many of us probably noticed this influx of ads that were centered around racial equity. Well, what I noticed from many of the ads were that there was this infusion of people of color into the ads to still serve the purpose of the organization. McDonald's took a different path. So what McDonald's did was that they donated their entire spot. They donated their entire advertising spot, and they pulled in an organization, I want to get this right, an advertising organization called Wyden and Kennedy, to intentionally select Black content creators to share their work during their spots. And I thought that was just such a powerful example of what sponsorship really looks like. They didn't just say, oh, we need some Black talent to be a part of our ad. They said, hey, how do we actually share our power? They gave up their slots to make an intentional effort to include difference. And so I think those two things are some really practical ways that we can think through some of these changes that we've been talking about today.
Yes.
So I think that all that will keep us busy from now until, you know, the next time we have one of these webinars. So everyone who's joined us today, you know, I think if you're keeping up with the conversation, we've covered a lot of different ways that you can take very practical steps. The moment we click end on this session, you can get right to it. So if you're an educator, and I keep saying that because we know that's who's in our audience, but though we don't really know, I mean, because even educators, right? We are humans, and we're somebody's, you know, son, daughter, somebody's friend, somebody's bestie, somebody's, you know, and I tell educators all the time, like myself, because I have to remind myself that even on our worst day, you're somebody's best hope. I mean, you are that student who's in your care. They're looking up to you and looking for you to inspire them and motivate them and take off all of the shackles that life and this society will put on them. And these are not always physical shackles. Sometimes psychological shackles that, you know, they picked up in first grade or second grade. Now they're in your fourth grade class, and here's the opportunity for you to be a liberating educator who specializes in inclusive pedagogy that Malaika talked about, or maybe even an emancipatory pedagogy that some of the theologians talk about, that our job is to make sure that they leave free. So how do you do it? We've talked about it. I think I echo the sentiments of my colleagues, and I'm going to put it back in the right order that Brittany gave us, and that is start with learning. Don't rush to listen yet. Learn. And I think this is hard for educators, right? Because we're experts in our subject, our disciplines. And so to admit, like, if you can ask yourself right now, I know it's not one of our polls, but since Tracy's going off script, I'll go off script and say, if you cannot answer the question that I am ready to talk about issues of intercultural communication or interaction, I'm not ready to talk about race. I'm not ready to talk about sexuality. I'm not ready to talk about gender. I can't talk about any of these pressing issues. Go to some news page online, and whatever the headlines are, if you can answer yourself and say, I'm really uncomfortable facilitating a conversation talking about that. Well, my sister and my brother, you got work to do. And the good news is, so do we all. So how do we start? We got to do the learning and the unlearning, because there's a whole lot of stuff I learned from probably well-intended adults in my childhood that did not prepare me for my adult life. I live right now next door to a Black Nigerian family, and the conversations that we have, we're still unpacking stuff that people put on us about each other and about how we, operate in the world. Though phenotypically we are similar, culturally we're quite different. If you don't know what those terms are, you got work to do. And what you can do is you can go to everybody's doctoral advisor, that's Google, and Google phenotypic, and Google differences between culture and race, and Google what's the difference between equity and equality. And I, have said on another gathering, if you don't like to read, that's a challenge, but the good news is you don't have to, you can watch it. Netflix and all of them have this is the season. If you want to learn and hear about historical and contemporary problems of identity difference, Netflix, and it's not a shout out to them, so Stars, YouTube, all of them. And if you're not a person who likes to read, you don't like to watch, the good news is you can listen. There's music and there's culture and art that you can take in, podcasts to help really water the soul, to get you ready for those conversations. Because here's the thing you got to hear all of us saying today. Look at the news. Our students are going to come to our institutions, K-12, higher ed, post-secondary, and demand it this fall. They're demanding it now, and they're going to demand it in person or in virtual spaces. So we've got to figure out, and we can borrow lessons from them. They become co-producers of knowledge with us, right? We've got to stop thinking we're up here as educator and they're down there waiting for us to fill them, but elevate them. If we don't, they'll elevate themselves and show you like, hey, wait a minute, I got a story. And you don't know my story, so let me tell it. Move out the way. Give me a way to tell my story. What does that mean practically, since that's what Tracy asked us to do? Even in my own teaching, I've stopped trying to anticipate what should all of the final paper topics be. Forget that. I'm never going to figure it out. I ask them, here's the goals of that assignment. You tell me what you want to write about. In online spaces, rather than assigning the forum every week, there are some weeks I have a guided prompt, but other weeks I say, you know what? You did the reading. Tell me what stood out for you. Tell me how it connects to your story. What's going on in your mind that makes sense of the reading that we were all engaged in? And I have found that I like the classes better when I let go sometimes and let them join me in this process that we're all in of trying to learn. These books and things you have to read don't have to be long. You can go back to Dr. Seuss. He's not perfect either, but Dr. Seuss once said, a person's a person no matter how small. And I'm a small dude, so that struck out to me, that we've got to get to this seeing. This is what being woke and staying woke and consciousness is about, that you can see lessons about difference and diversity in anything. Dr. Seuss, the ABCs, the news, whatever it might be, that you can sit with it, wrestle with it, and understand that there's a mixture of learning and unlearning necessary for us to move to listening. And ultimately, as Brittany said, I'm looking at my notes, through intentional action and experiences on the sponsorship. I'm going to stop there because I feel the spirit. So, amen.
We felt it too. Thank you, Dr. Strayhorn. For those of you, we've got 1 minute left officially, but this is powerful. And I really wanted to share with, I really want Dr. Charles as well to speak up on this idea of knowledge, motivation, and organization, because I feel that infrastructure is really important. What can you give us in 60 seconds or less?
Sure. I love KMO. And I think if you have an opportunity to read Clark and Estes' book on why organizations fail, they tell you they fail based on these three categories: knowledge, motivation, organization. And as someone who has led organizations, who's worked in universities in the US and in the UK, it always comes down to these three. is either that we want to reach a particular goal, whether it's for people to want to engage in intercultural conversations, or we want to improve retention, or we want to build communities on campuses, whether they're virtual or on site. We hire people, we have people in these roles that are doing these jobs, but sometimes we need to start talking to ourselves about, do they have the right knowledge and skills, especially in this current environment, because there are going to be people in the admissions office, to study abroad, to whoever they might be, going to have conversations about race, equality, equity, inclusion. And because they're not going to be able to get to someone else, you can't pass the buck anymore. Right. Everyone in the organization is going to have to be responsible. So you have to ask yourself, does the people we need to be able to do this job have the knowledge and skills? And I think motivation also talks about whether or not people are motivated to do this kind of work. And we recognize that people don't. Not everyone is motivated to do the work, and whether or not the organization has the tools. Trying to go online and you don't have the right bandwidth or the right technology to go online, but not everybody got to go online. And now you have to see all these partnerships with outsourcing online work to 2U and other places like that. And so you have to start asking yourself, how do we do better by putting ourselves and examining the issues, the gaps that exist based in these compartments? And I think the conversation today really talked about that, talked about ourselves and how we need to improve, how we need to be motivated and motivate others, but also go back to our organizations and say, do we have the right safe spaces and systems in place in order to achieve these goals of DEI?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Charles. And we are in Crisis Triaging 103. We're going to get really granular about training for educators, training staff, institution-wide for this type of work. So poll number 3, this is a final poll. This is not an anonymous poll this time, but we do want to hear from you. When it comes to practical interventions and solutions, I would like to A, actively contribute to the conversation and provide resources, B, receive more information and additional resources. Hopefully none of y'all will choose C, none of the above, but I'm leading the witness there. So we want to know how involved you would like to be in keeping this conversation going. And there are several of you who attended our first webinar, Crisis Triaging 101, back in May. It's really beautiful to see you participating again. So thank you for that. And I want to open myself up to having dialogues with any of you on this webinar, previous webinar, upcoming webinar, who are specifically interested in actively contributing to the conversation and providing resources. I'm more than willing to do a virtual coffee chat or a masked coffee chat, depending on which city you're in, and look forward to that dialogue. APTO is, as we've shared a little bit, normally we don't do a plug for APTO, and I don't want you to think of this as a plug because it's not monetarily involved, but we are looking right now for what we're referring to as beta innovation partners, particularly in higher education, that can, one, help us to improve the pedagogy and the learning strategy around creating this dialogue of speaking human. How do I speak human? How do I effectively share my story? And how do I effectively listen to the story of others with empathy as a baseline for the greater learning journeys that are going to occur? Everything from awareness and education about inter and intercultural journeys, communication skills, language, knowledge, culture, all the way through to that next step in the journey, such as, as Brittany has alluded to, moving into the workforce. And I love what Malika said about it starts in the family. It starts at the individual level. Individuals are raised in the family. Those families do the best they can to get that equity for education. Then it's our job as educators to get people out there into organizations, making a change, making a difference. That impacts our communities. That's what makes up our world. So thank you all very much for joining today. It's been a real pleasure. Let's give a round of applause or snaps to our panel speakers. And please do include any final thoughts, comments, or questions in the chat box. We've got some resources that our speakers graciously contributed here, and we're going to be adding more of those to the Apto Global resources page, and we'll send out a link and a recording of this video to all of you. Have a wonderful Thursday, and go call some students. Bye, everybody.